Hello Whitby students, and welcome to this video lesson on narrative structure in The Handmaid's Tale. Thank you all of you guys for keeping up with the series, making sure that you make clear notes, and that wherever there's a task in these video lessons that you do your best to complete the task. This one should be a really crucial insight into the way that Handmaids works, because we're going to think overall about the way that the narrative is structured. Before we do, let's have a think about psychological realism. What's it like to actually have an inner psychological world? This is what Atwood's trying to create with Offred. She's trying to create something that's entirely believable. She's trying to create a realistic psychology to which we can relate. Offred has to feel like what it's like to be a person. Well, we're kind of asking the question, what is it like to experience things? What are our inner worlds like? They contain different things. They contain our sensations, our independent perceptions and thoughts, and our memories, all mixing together to kind of make a what it is like to be us. Well, that's what the text is like as well. And this idea about psychological realism combining experience, thought, and memory, this is how the text itself is structured. And there's quite a simple principle, I guess, to the way that Handmaids is structured, as are many psychologically realistic texts. The present is juxtaposed with the past, or experiences are juxtaposed with memories, if you like. I think the picture there is quite a good indication of how Handmaids is structured. There's this kind of juxtaposition of the past and the present, which presents, I suppose, what's implied in the photograph, the loss of a way of life, or the loss of individuals. So throughout the novel, her perceptions of the present are meaningfully juxtaposed with memories of the past, and sometimes that meaning is kind of made explicit to the reader, but sometimes it's implied. So sometimes Atwood has structured the narrative by simply placing side by side events from Offred's memory with events from the present of Gilead, and I suppose it's down to us as readers to interpret the significance. Let's think in more detail about how this looks. I think that there are three really quite distinct kind of time frames within the novel. The first being the present, which is the events that take place in the time of Gilead, in the commander's household, and those events are presented chronologically, and they're also presented in the present tense. So it begins with Offred going shopping. She then visits a doctor. She then takes part in this horrific ceremony in which the commander tries to impregnate her. The birth of Janine's child, or Offwarren's child, the visit to the commander, all of these events are presented, all right the way up to her escape. They're presented in a meaningful chronological order. But other events, as we go into the recent and the distant past, are not presented in chronological order. So sometimes this is framed as Offred's reflections on things that have happened in the very near present. For example, her description of meeting Serena Joy for the first time is described actually in the past tense, although it's an event that must have happened just before, I suppose, the main chronology of the narrative happens. But going back a little further, her memories within Gilead of the Red Centre, including the opening chapter, the gym, including her memories of the aunts and their advice, Moira's escape and Janine. These events are all frequently juxtaposed with parts of the future narrative. And these events, I suppose, are in a recent past, in that they're within the past of Gilead. But then, even going back even further, we have Offred's experiences of her life before Gilead, going all the way back to her childhood. And some of these distant events in the past become ever more vague and nebulous, I suppose, as we go back into a deeper past. Frequently within the narrative, all three of these are juxtaposed. Events in the present frequently recall to Offred for example, the advice of the aunts, which then perhaps even leads her even further back into a pre-Gileadian memory. So this is a significant way of thinking about the structure in terms of the chronological present and then almost two kinds of past, which gives, I guess, when we're talking about psychological realism, it gives Offred's character a lot of psychological depth. So these help create, as I said, a realistic identity for Offred. They also help in terms of characterizing Offred. So we imply a lot of our understanding about Offred's values, what sort of person she is, her desires and her emotions. These are constructed through the juxtaposition of past events and the present. One key way that Atwood gets us to really care about Offred, or to really have an attachment with her, is through the exploration of the really traumatic events of being separated from her family, her memories of Luke, her memories of her mother, but particularly her memories of her daughter. These form a kind of characterization of Offred as a really, a loving mother full of maternal desire and maternal instincts, maternal care. And these are things that we can really relate to in Offred, and it's a vital part of her characterization. But these juxtapositions also show us things perhaps more broadly, not just about Offred, but about society. So they show us these processes by which Gilead or a dystopian society can come about. And there are frequent juxtapositions of pre-dystopian and dystopian elements, which really present readers with quite a stark contrast of what's recognisably their lives now, or our lives now, and what could very conceivably or very easily be our lives given some negative political changes. So this enables us as readers to compare the familiar world that we exist, represented in Offred's memories, with this unfamiliar world of Gilead, this unfamiliar but really fearfully possible world. Okay, if we take that the narrative is composed from juxtaposing events in different time frames, we need to ask the question: how is this managed? How does the language make this possible? Surely it would be confusing. And I suppose there are more or less obvious ways for a narrative to guide readers through these shifts. But here's some of the ways that Offred's narrative uses to guide us through shifts in time. Well, Dexis, as we know from looking at previous lesson, is language that explicitly references time frames and actions, and that, of course, can be used to very explicitly tell us when something is happening. Similarly, grammar, the tense and aspect, there is a significant shift between the present tense and the past tense as Offred moves between her experiences in the present and her memories in the past. But also our schema, where there are predictable or recognisable scenarios. These come into conflict as we looked at in the first chapter, where perhaps our memory of or our understanding of what American high school gymnasiums are like, and our schema attached to that, comes into conflict with our schema about prison camps or concentration camps. Well, some of these schema belong in Gilead, and they are schema that we revise and update for Gilead, and that we keep for Gilead as we read the novel. Some of the schema are perhaps schema related to a more familiar setting, and these schema are used to help us move quite subtly in the narrative from the present to the past. Descriptive language, and particularly settings. Settings can be used very effectively, just as a filmmaker, of course, changes scene when they want to move within their narrative. So does an author with the description of setting. Characters are also triggers to understood time frames. For example, Aunt Lydia is always an indication of the education that Offred received in the Red Centre, whereas characters like Mum, Luke and her daughter, they belong to a time frame that we already pre-understand. But there are also subtle linguistic changes, I guess, even the register of character voice, but also things such as the lexis, so the language of Gilead versus the pre-Gilead normal, if you like, language, can signify a subtle change in the narrative. So let's have a look in detail at how that works in practice. And you need to now pause the video and read chapter 24. Chapter 24 describes Offred returning to her room after her first illegal meeting with the commander. So it's only a short chapter. I'd like to reread it, and I'd like to try and chart the sequence of the narrative. What is the sequence of events that are presented in Offred's narrative? Where do they shift between the present, the recent past, and the distant past? We're also going to ask, or I'd like you to explore, how language is used to guide the reader through this shifting narrative, and also what these juxtapositions tell us, whether explicitly or how they imply significance and characterization of Offred, etc. So reread the chapter now. Begin by attempting to chart the sequence of events within that chapter. You may have come up with something like this, and if you look at that first column, I've charted myself the sequence of events in chapter 24. She begins Offred by describing her movement back to her room and gives a reflection on her own situation. She then goes back to remember the teachings of Aunt Lydia at the Red Centre, and then I suppose brings forward to a more recent point in time, the very recent past, in recalling the commander asking for a kiss. We then go back into a much deeper memory of her recalling a TV program she saw as a child in which a Nazi concentration camp commander is interviewed, and there's a reflection on that. And then at the end of the chapter, she comes right back to the present and describes herself having this kind of hysterical, uncontrolled laughing fit in her room. So we have almost a full circle, circular narrative within the chapter, or what might be more usefully described as a frame, in that the chapter is framed in the present tense opening and closing, and it follows a sort of a circular pattern or a deeper journey into the distant past via the recent past and then returning to the present. So let's think now about how language is used to convey these shifts in the narrative. Well, here's an example, the opening sentence, I believe the opening sentence of the chapter. I go back along the dimmed hall and up the muffled stairs stealthily to my room. Well, firstly, we can see that that's in the present tense. It also gives us a picture of setting and that we can recognise as Offred going back to her room within the commander's household. Well, how do we recognise that it's the commander's household and not perhaps another event within Offred's life? Well, we are using our schema. We're using our schema because we're bringing into play our pre-existing knowledge of what Offred's behaviour is like within this house. So we've got the dimmed hall and the muffled stairs, and she is moving stealthily, all of which are indications of how timid she is, and we know that obviously Offred's status in this household is like that of a slave, so we can interpret the reasons for her movement, or the reasons for the room, the setting being described the way it is, using our schema. We've also got my room, which is something that's explicitly given treatment earlier in the novel, where Offred finally sort of admits to ownership of her room, and I suppose that acts as a sort of a schematic trigger for us to understand where we are. So the tense and the setting help us establish the time frame. But how does this imply some significance to us? Well, we know that the description of the rooms I've already discussed displays her guilt, possibly her low status. She is creeping back in context to her room after conducting an illegal meeting with the commander. This reflection, the first part of her reflection anyway in this chapter, doesn't explicitly reference events with the commander, but she has this sort of reflective tone where she decides to take stock of who she is and implies that she knows that this is a significant changing point in her life. This is a significant event. As she says to herself, I have one more chance. Okay, can you continue? Pause the video at this point. Look closely at chapter 24. You should have a sequence of the narrative. If you don't, then mine is already offered there in that column. But what I would like you to do is I would like you to identify how the language shifted the narrative. There's looking at the range of features that we discussed earlier that could possibly be used to help shift a narrative, and then I'd like you to explore how that juxtaposition of events is helping to imply some significance within the text. So pause the video at this point, complete the grid. Good luck. I won't go through my own analysis of the chart, but there are a range of different techniques used by Atwood to convey shifts in the narrative, sometimes very explicitly, sometimes actually quite subtly. All of these shifts have an implied or sometimes more obvious or less obvious significance, in that Offred's mind is putting these events together for a particular reason. So to broadly sketch that, within this chapter, she obviously is responding to something very significant that's happened to her. And she responds by reflecting on both the teachings of Gilead and what she should possibly do according to Aunt Lydia, and how Aunt Lydia might interpret that event, and then her own sort of personal, deeper interpretation based on her life before. So I guess this is Offred using different memories at different times in her life to evaluate the events that have happened to her. It's a really good chapter for illustrating how shifts in narrative construct this realistic psychology for Offred. Right, have a go at your own. Choose a chapter, preferably a shorter chapter, and have a look at how time is shifted within the narrative. And for each of these shifts, you need to be thinking about how the language achieves the shift, i.e. how the language guides the reader through changing in time frame, but also how this juxtaposition of different events in Offred's mind is showing some significance to the reader. So, in terms of a summary, we've looked at the structure of the narrative within Handmaid's Tale and some really clear principles for how the narrative is structured. We know that Offred's narrative is freely shifting between her real-time present experience and her memories of the past, and that we discussed about how those memories can be more or less recent. Events and memories, we know, are sequenced into meaningful juxtapositions that can imply significance to the reader. And we also have looked at a range of different linguistic methods that can be used to manage these transitions in the narrative. Thank you for your focus. I hope it's been worthwhile. Make sure that you take notes and take part in the activities to make sure that you get the best learning from these lessons. I hope you're all well. Once again, thanks for your focus.